It all started with boredom, the kind of boredom that creeps in during the late hours of the night when the world is asleep and the internet feels like an endless void. Nick was a tech-savvy college student who prided himself on exploring the darkest corners of the web. The surface web was too tame, too predictable. The dark web, however, was an uncharted ocean of mystery, danger, and, if rumors were true, terror. One night, Nick decided to dive in. Armed with a secure browser, a VPN, and a false sense of invincibility, he navigated the hidden sites. Forums filled with cryptic conversations, black markets selling items he dared not imagine, and sites offering services that made his skin crawl. But it was one link, innocuously titled The Silent Room, that caught his eye. The description was vague. For those who seek the truth, the cost is your peace of mind. Curiosity won. He clicked the link and was directed to a plain black web page with a single line of text. Do you wish to enter the silent room? Below it, a small yes button blinked. Nick hesitated, but his curiosity was a force stronger than reason. He clicked. His screen went black. A few seconds later, a grainy live video feed appeared. The camera showed a dimly lit room with concrete walls. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, and on the chair sat a man, his face obscured by a burlap sack. His hands were tied behind him, and his head hung low as if he were unconscious. A chat box popped up next to the video. Welcome to the silent room. Do not share this link. Do not look away. Nick's fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to type. What is this? Watch. Before Nick could respond, another figure entered the frame. This person was dressed in all black, their face hidden behind a featureless white mask. They carried a metal tool that glinted ominously under the single light bulb in the room. The masked figure walked up to the man in the chair, yanked his head back, and began speaking, though there was no audio. The silence was oppressive, more unsettling than screams would have been. The chat box flashed again. Do you want to help him? Nick's heart raced. Was this some twisted game? A sick prank? He didn't respond. If you wish to help, send a message. Otherwise, watch. Nick typed hastily. Me. How can I help? The masked figure paused, turning toward the camera as if they could see Nick. Then they walked out of frame. When they returned, they held a sign with an address written on it. Nick's address. Panic surged through him. How did they know? How could they know? He slammed his laptop shut and stared at it as though it might explode. The room felt colder, and every creak of the old house suddenly seemed menacing. He unplugged his computer, turned off his router, and spent the rest of the night jumping at shadows. The next morning, convinced it had been a dream or an elaborate prank, he decided to check his laptop. Against his better judgment, he reconnected to the internet and opened his browser. There was no record of the site, no history of his visit to the silent room. It was as if it had never existed. For weeks, he tried to convince himself it was all in his head, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Then, late one night, as he was trying to sleep, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number.
No.
Why did you leave? He needed you. Nick froze. His heart pounded as another message came through. Check your front porch. He wanted to ignore it, but fear compelled him to look. With trembling hands, he opened his front door. On the porch was a small package wrapped in brown paper. He didn't want to touch it, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. He brought it inside, unwrapped it, and felt his stomach drop. Inside was a USB drive and a note that read, "The silent room never ends." Against every instinct, he plugged the USB into an old, unused laptop. A single file was on it labeled openme.mp4. He clicked on it, and the video began playing. It was the same room, the same chair, the same man with the burlap sack over his head. Only this time, the masked figure wasn't in the frame. Instead, the man in the chair looked directly at the camera and said, "Why didn't you save me?" The screen went black, and Nick's laptop shut down, never to turn on again. From that night on, Nick's life became a waking nightmare. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man in the chair. Every time he looked at a screen, he felt as if someone was watching him from the other side. And every so often, he'd receive a text, always from an unknown number, always asking the same question: why did you leave? It was supposed to be a normal night for Claire, a late shift at the diner and then home to her tiny apartment. But life has a way of turning ordinary evenings into something far more sinister. That night, she learned the true meaning of fear. It started when she received a text from an unknown number just as she was locking up the diner. The message was simple but strange. Do you believe in coincidences? Claire assumed it was a wrong number and ignored it, walking briskly to her car. The parking lot was deserted, the silence pressing in around her like a heavy blanket. As she drove home, another text buzzed on her phone. "You're almost there. Are you ready?" Her heart skipped a beat. The message sent a chill down her spine. She glanced around, but the street was empty, just rows of darkened houses and flickering streetlights. Claire told herself it was a prank, probably one of her coworkers trying to scare her. But her hands shook as she gripped the wheel, and her breath came in shallow bursts. She checked the rearview mirror compulsively, half expecting to see headlights behind her, but there was nothing. She finally pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, hurried inside, and locked the door. The tiny space felt safe, a cocoon against whatever was out there. She double-checked the locks, closed the curtains, and sat on her couch, trying to calm down. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't bother locking the door." Claire's stomach dropped. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Someone was watching her. She ran to the door, checking the lock again, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. Another message. "Check the closet." The air in the apartment seemed to freeze. Claire felt her pulse in her throat. Her closet was in the bedroom, a sliding door she rarely touched because it stuck on the track. She didn't want to look. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to leave, to run to her car and never look back. But fear and curiosity are a dangerous combination. Against her better judgment, she crept to the bedroom. Her hand trembled as she reached for the closet door. She yanked it open in one swift motion, and it was empty. Just a few jackets and an old pair of boots. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Her phone buzzed again. Not that closet. A faint creak came from the hall closet, the one she never used. Claire froze. The sound was so quiet she almost thought she imagined it. Almost. Her phone buzzed once more. "I'm closer than you think." Claire couldn't breathe. She slowly backed into the corner of the bedroom, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She wanted to call someone, anyone, but her fingers felt numb. The hallway was dark, and she couldn't see the closet from where she stood, but she could feel its presence, looming like an open wound in her apartment. Another creak, louder this time. It wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, was in there. Her phone buzzed again, but she couldn't bring herself to look at the message. She just stared at the hallway, heart pounding, the silence around her heavier than ever. And then, as if in slow motion, she heard the closet door slide open. Her breath hitched, and she pressed herself tighter against the wall, the state wishing she could disappear into it. The dark hallway seemed to stretch, shadows shifting as if alive. She could just make out a figure, tall and angular, stepping out of the closet. The figure didn't move like a person. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side as if studying her. Claire's phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a soft thud, but she barely noticed. The figure took a step forward, then another. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Claire wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She sank to the floor, her vision blurring with tears. Her phone buzzed one last time. The figure stopped just outside the bedroom doorway, its face, or what passed for a face, hidden in the shadows. Claire's trembling hand reached for the phone. The message was short, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. "Turn around." It was a quiet night when Liam, a freelance graphic designer, found himself buried in deadlines. The glow of his computer screen was the only light in the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls of his small apartment. He was used to the solitude, but that night, the silence felt heavier, like the air was charged with something unseen. As he worked, a notification popped up on his screen. It wasn't from an email or a message, just a blank, gray box with no sender or subject line. Confused, Liam clicked on it. His browser opened to a plain black page with a single line of text. "Do you want to play a game?" Liam assumed it was a pop-up or some kind of ad. He closed the window and returned to his work, brushing it off. But the message appeared again. This time, the text was different. "You can't ignore me, Liam." His heart skipped. The page had addressed him by name. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Was it a prank? A virus? He quickly disconnected from the internet, but the black page remained on his screen. The cursor blinked, waiting. Then, without him touching the keyboard, words began to appear. "Don't try to run. The game has already started." Liam stared at the screen, his pulse racing. He tried to force the laptop to shut down, but the keys didn't respond. The power button was useless. The black page remained, unyielding. "Let's make it simple," the text continued. "I'll ask a question, and you'll answer. If you lie, you'll regret it." Liam's breath hitched as the first question appeared. "Have you ever hurt someone intentionally?" His mind reeled. Memories flooded back, arguments with friends, the one time he'd cheated on a test, the cruel words he'd said in a moment of anger. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Yes," he finally typed, his hands shaking. "Good," the page responded. "Honesty will keep you safe. Yulia, for now." Another question appeared. "Do you think you deserve what's coming?" A knot formed in his stomach. What did that mean? Was this a sick joke or something worse? He typed, "I don't know." The screen flickered, and for a moment, Liam thought the computer might finally shut down. But when the image returned, it wasn't text. It was a live video feed. The camera showed his living room. Liam froze. His laptop had no external camera. There was no way this was coming from his device. The angle was wrong, too. The video was from above, as if someone had placed a camera in the corner of his ceiling. He stood, heart pounding, and scanned the room. There was nothing. No camera, no sign of intrusion. But when he looked back at the screen, the feed had changed. It now showed his bedroom, the camera positioned to capture the bed and the closet door just behind it. Liam's blood ran cold. His bedroom door was closed. It had been closed all night. The chat box reappeared on the screen. "Should I open the closet for you?" "No," Liam whispered, though his hands didn't type it. He felt paralyzed. The feed zoomed in slowly, focusing on the closet door. It didn't move, but Liam swore he saw a faint shadow shifting beneath the crack at the bottom. The chat box flashed again. "There's no use hiding. Look behind you." Every instinct screamed at him not to move, but he couldn't help it. He turned his head ever so slightly, scanning the room behind him. There was nothing but the faint outline of his furniture in the dim light. When he looked back at the screen, the feed had changed again. It now showed him sitting at his desk. The camera angle was close, too close, as if someone or something was standing directly behind him. Liam spun around, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room was empty. The chat box appeared one last time. "You can't escape. The game never ends." The laptop screen went black, and for a moment, all Liam could hear was the pounding of his heart. Then, a quiet, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears. It was coming from his bedroom, the sound of the closet door creaking open. Evelyn was an avid fan of vintage shopping, always on the hunt for unique items with a story behind them. One rainy afternoon, she wandered into a dimly lit antique store tucked away in an alley she had never noticed before. The air inside was heavy, carrying the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. Shelves were lined with odd trinkets, faded photographs, and items that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who dared look closely. In the corner of the shop, she found it, an ornate mirror with a gilded frame. The glass was slightly tarnished, but its craftsmanship was exquisite. It seemed out of place, too grand for the dusty store. The shopkeeper, a pale, gaunt man with sunken eyes, appeared at her side without a sound. "That one," he said in a voice like rustling leaves, "is not like the others. Be careful." Evelyn laughed nervously, assuming he was trying to add an air of mystery to sell the piece. "How much?" she asked. He hesitated before giving her a price that was shockingly low. "If you take it," he added, "don't place it where you sleep." She shrugged off his warning as superstitious nonsense, paid for the mirror, and carried it home. Her apartment was small, so finding a place for the mirror was tricky. Despite the shopkeeper's odd advice, she ended up hanging it on the wall opposite her bed. She admired its antique charm, feeling a small thrill at her find. That night, Evelyn woke suddenly, the room unnaturally cold. Her curtains fluttered though the windows were shut. She rolled over to check her phone, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, something else caught her attention. In the mirror's reflection, she could see herself lying in bed. But something was off. The reflection wasn't entirely still. Her mirrored self was staring back at her, wide awake with a faint, unnatural smile. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up and looked directly at the mirror. Her reflection mimicked her perfectly now, showing her own wide, frightened eyes. She laughed nervously, convincing herself it had been her imagination. The next day, she avoided the mirror. She went about her routine, but an uneasy feeling clung to her. That night, as she tried to sleep, she felt an inexplicable pull toward it. as if something within the mirror wanted her attention. Unable to resist, she looked. This time, her reflection didn't mirror her movements. It was standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with that same eerie smile. The air grew heavier, and her body felt paralyzed with fear. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection tilted its head, but its lips didn't move. Instead, a soft, raspy voice came from the room itself, echoing around her. "Why did you bring me here?" Evelyn scrambled out of bed, throwing the lights on. The mirror showed only her terrified face now, but she knew she hadn't imagined it. She tore the mirror from the wall, carried it to her living room, and shoved it into a closet. She stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak of the apartment setting her nerves on edge. The next morning, she decided to get rid of it. She dragged the mirror to the alley behind her building and left it by the dumpsters. That night, she finally felt a sense of relief and fell into an exhausted sleep. But at 3 a.m., a loud crash jolted her awake. Heart pounding, she tiptoed into the living room. The closet door was wide open, and there, leaning against the wall, was the mirror. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her throat felt like it was closing as she stared at the mirror. Her reflection stared back, but it wasn't her. The figure in the glass had hollow, black eyes and a grin that stretched too wide for its face. Before she could move, her hand reached out from the mirror and grabbed her wrist. The next day, Evelyn's apartment was silent. The mirror hung back on the wall in her bedroom, pristine as ever. Her friends grew worried when they couldn't reach her, and the landlord eventually let them in. The apartment was untouched, except for the mirror, and in its reflection, if you looked closely, you could see Evelyn. She was smiling, but her eyes were black. It was nearly midnight when David, a long-haul trucker, found himself on a desolate stretch of highway deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The road was a ribbon of asphalt winding through dense, moonlit forests, and his only companions were the hum of his engine and the faint static of the CB radio. The night had an eerie stillness to it, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. As he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught a figure standing on the side of the road. A woman, pale and barefoot, wearing a long, tattered dress that fluttered in the cold night air. Her dark hair was wild and matted, obscuring most of her face. David's first instinct was to drive on. Stopping in the middle of nowhere for a stranger was a bad idea. But as he passed her, she raised her hand, waving weakly. His conscience got the better of him. He pulled over a few yards ahead and waited. The woman approached the truck slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. When she reached the passenger door, she didn't open it or say a word. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly, staring up at him. David hesitated before rolling down the window a crack. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice cautious. The woman nodded once but didn't speak. Against his better judgment, he unlocked the door and she climbed in. The cab instantly felt colder, like the warmth had been sucked out of the air. David glanced at her again, trying to get a better look at her face, but her hair still obscured it. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Just ahead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It sounded strained, like it hadn't been used in years. David nodded, gripping the wheel tightly as he pulled back onto the highway. The silence between them was oppressive. Every so often, he'd glance over at her, but she just sat there, staring straight ahead. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her nails were dirty and broken, and her skin looked almost translucent in the dim light. After a few minutes, he tried again. "You from around here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned her head to face him. Her eyes were dark, too dark, like pools of ink, and her lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. David's stomach churned. He focused on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The CB radio crackled, a brief burst of static that made him jump. He reached to turn it off, but a voice came through, faint and distorted. "Don't look at her." David froze. He glanced at the radio, then at the woman. She was still staring at him, her smile wider now, almost unnatural. The voice on the radio came again, more urgent this time. "Don't look at her." David's breath came in shallow gasps. The air in the cab felt heavier, suffocating. He tried to keep his eyes on the road, but his peripheral vision caught something impossible. The woman's neck seemed to stretch unnaturally, her face inching closer to his, her smile splitting her face like a crack in porcelain. He slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, throwing him forward against the seatbelt. When he looked to his right, The passenger seat was empty. The woman was gone. David sat there, heart pounding, staring at the empty seat. The cab was deathly silent. He reached for the door handle, needing to confirm she was gone, but a soft, chilling voice whispered in his ear, "I'm not finished." He whipped his head around, but the cab was empty. Panicked, he threw the truck into gear and sped down the highway, his pulse hammering in his ears. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, parking his truck under the bright lights of a gas station. When he finally felt safe enough to check the passenger's seat, his heart nearly stopped. The seatbelt was still buckled, and on the dashboard was a single dark strand of hair. David never drove that stretch of road again. And every so often on quiet nights, he hears her voice on the CB radio, whispering his name. Late one evening, Sophia sat alone in her small city apartment, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. She had spent the past few weeks exploring obscure apps, the kind no one talks about, tucked away in the darker corners of the internet. It was a guilty pleasure of hers, finding odd, forgotten pieces of software that felt like digital ghost towns. That's when she found it. Mirror. The app's description was vague. See what you're missing. Curious, she downloaded it. When she opened it, the screen went entirely black for a moment, and then the app activated her front-facing camera. At first, it seemed like a normal reflection, just her sitting on her couch, bathed in the pale light of her phone screen. Then the prompt appeared. "Ask a question." Sophia chuckled. It was probably one of those novelty apps meant to spook people. Feeling playful, she typed, "What's my future?" The screen flickered, and her reflection twisted slightly, the image distorting as if underwater. A response appeared in thin, white text at the top of the screen. "You'll find out soon." Her laugh faltered. The effect was unsettling, but she chalked it up to clever programming. She asked another question, "Am I alone?" The response was almost immediate. "No." Her stomach tightened. She glanced around her empty apartment, the silence now oppressive. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but before she could type anything else, the app automatically switched to her back camera. The phone now showed her living room behind her, exactly as it should have been. But then something moved, a dark shape, just barely visible in the corner near her bedroom door. Sophia's blood ran cold. She whipped her head around to look, but the corner was empty. When she turned back to her phone, the shape was gone. Her heart pounded as she closed the app and locked her phone, tossing it onto the coffee table. She told herself it was a trick of the app, some creepy gimmick designed to freak people out. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She stood up, pacing the room, trying to calm herself. The apartment felt too quiet, the shadows too deep. That's when she heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from her bedroom. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Slowly, she crept toward the bedroom, her pulse pounding in her ears. She pushed the door open, the hinges creaking ominously. The room was empty, just as it should have been. She let out a shaky laugh, scolding herself for letting an app scare her. But when she turned to leave, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She hesitated, then picked it up. The app had reopened on its own. This time, the camera was already recording, showing her reflection. Except, it wasn't her. The face on the screen looked like her, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark, too wide, staring directly into her soul. Her reflection smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was malicious, predatory. The text at the top of the screen changed again. "Let me in." Sophia dropped the phone, her scream catching in her throat. The screen cracked as it hit the floor, but the reflection continued to grin up at her through the shattered glass. The lights in her apartment flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. And in the silence, she heard a voice, soft and cold, coming from the direction of the phone. "I'm already here." No one ever heard from Sophia again. When the police entered her apartment days later, they found no signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play, just her phone lying on the coffee table. The app was gone. Eric was a night security guard at an old office building downtown. The job was uneventful. Just him, a flashlight, and a bank of aging security monitors. The building was mostly empty now. Half the floors were unleased, their fluorescent lights flickering like faint ghosts in the dead of night. One particular night, a storm raged outside, rain slashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. Eric sat at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee, when something on the monitors caught his eye. The feed from the 14th floor showed movement. A shadow darted across the corridor, just barely visible in the grainy black and white footage. Eric frowned. He was sure no one else was in the building. Tenants had left hours ago, and the cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until dawn. He grabbed his flashlight, strapped on his radio, and headed for the elevator. As he ascended, the fluorescent lights inside the elevator flickered, and for a split second he thought he saw a faint reflection of someone standing behind him in the mirrored doors. But when he turned, the elevator was empty. He stepped out onto the 14th floor. The air was cold, unnaturally so. The long corridor stretched ahead, lined with empty cubicles and dusty conference rooms. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. "Hello?" Eric called out, his voice echoing eerily down the hall. No response. He began to walk, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. The 14th floor had always unsettled him. It was the only floor that hadn't been renovated, the carpeting old and musty, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. As he passed one of the conference rooms, he noticed the door was ajar. He could have sworn it had been closed earlier. He hesitated, then pushed it open with the butt of his flashlight. The room was empty, just a long table surrounded by dusty chairs. But on the far wall, something caught his attention. A single handprint was smeared on the glass of the window. It was too high up to have been made by someone standing outside, and the size was wrong, too elongated, the fingers unnaturally long. A crackle came through his radio, breaking the silence. At first it was just static, but then a faint voice whispered through. "Eric." His blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, warped, and unrecognizable. "Who is this?" he demanded, gripping the radio tightly. The static surged, and the voice came again, louder this time. "I see you." His flashlight flickered and died. Plunged into near darkness, Eric fumbled for his phone, switching on its flashlight. The beam was weak but enough to guide him back to the elevator. He didn't care what was happening, he just wanted to leave. As he neared the elevator, he froze. The doors were open, and inside stood a figure. It wasn't human. The thing was tall, its body unnaturally thin, limbs too long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Its eyes were pitch black, voids that seemed to swallow the dim light. It stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on Eric. He took a step back, heart pounding, but the thing moved, jerkily, like a puppet on strings, stepping out of the elevator and into the hallway. "Stay back!" Eric shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. The figure didn't listen. It took another step at that one, its movements unnatural and wrong, its limbs contorting as it advanced. Eric turned and ran, his phone's flashlight bouncing wildly. He dashed into the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. The sound of its pursuit echoed behind him, a series of rapid, skittering movements that didn't match its humanoid shape. He burst onto the ground floor, his breath ragged. He didn't stop running until he was outside in the storm, the rain soaking him to the bone. When he finally turned back, the building loomed dark and silent. The 14th floor windows were pitch black, but he swore he saw a faint outline of a figure staring down at him. Eric quit his job the next morning. Weeks later, he heard that the building had been condemned. The official reason was structural instability, but rumors swirled about why tenants had left in droves, why the cleaning staff refused to work after dark. No one stayed on the 14th floor for long. Those who did often spoke of hearing whispers, seeing shadows, or feeling a cold hand brush against their skin when no one was there. The building was torn down a year later, but they say that on stormy nights, if you walk past the lot where it once stood, you can still hear static crackling faintly in the air. And if you listen closely, you might hear your name.